So Shalom Aleichem. Now that we've done all the cutting up and everything, and I'll promise not to call anybody else a nudnik and all of that, right? Okay, we'll get started. Where are we at in, I know where we are, I'm just an introduction to where. In the book based on the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Judah Loew of Prague, a book that is put together for us by Rabbi Tuvia Basser. And we're studying, and have been studying for a little while, the different sayings of the fathers, the chapters of the fathers, Pirkei Avot, in the Mishnah. We are on, actually, we're discussing and talking about Mishnah number 6, chapter 1 of Mishnah number 6. In the book, Pirkei Avot, based on the Maharal, we're on page 31. That's what Jason needed. Okay. We're on page 31 at the very top of the page. Let's read Mishnah number 6 again, and so that we can get an idea of where we were and where we left off, okay? Yehoshua ben Parachia and Nitai of Arbel received the tradition from them. Yehoshua ben Parachia says, and the translation says, accept a Torah teacher upon yourself. Then the next line is acquire a friend for yourself. And the last line of Yehoshua ben Parachia is, and judge everyone favorably. Now we started out talking, and we finished the last time we were talking, how the previous set of rabbis actually, they were focused on the household, on the family in the household, okay? Which he says is the inner circle of our relationships. And this pair of rabbis, Yehoshua ben Parachia and Nitai ha'Arbeli, they broadened that because they are now addressing relationships outside the home. And he even says, how are these three things? Establishing a teacher, and I like that better, even though the translation is going to continually say, accept upon yourself a teacher, and I understand, or a rabbi, a Torah teacher upon yourself. I understand what that means, and we'll talk about it, but to be very, very honest with you, the text in Hebrew actually says, Aseh lecha rav. Aseh lecha rav. Aseh, make lecha, for yourself, a rabbi. And so it's very, the subtleties in this are very unusual. Because to be truthful with you, you think, here's the idea. Okay, I don't have a rabbi. I don't have a Torah teacher. And so Yehoshua ben Parachia says, if you don't have a Torah teacher, make yourself one. Find one, is what he's trying to say. Now, the reason they translate always accept in this case is because that really is, if you find a rabbi, the Jewish idea of that is you accept him upon yourself. He is your rabbi. It's not like, okay, I accept him as my rabbi as long as he says everything that I agree with, everything that I already know, okay? Well, obviously he's not going to teach you anything, all right? And many, especially non-Jewish people really don't understand this concept of what it means when they make for themselves a rabbi and accept upon themselves a Torah teacher, a rabbi. They really are, as long as they consider themselves his student, he really does have a level of authority over them. And this is a totally unknown concept, especially in the United States of America. No, like it's kind of like, everything's okay, and I'll follow his advice, I'll accept his Torah teaching, just as long as he doesn't tell me what to do. But a rabbi, a real Torah teacher, he is going to, whether he does it directly or whether he does it in a roundabout way through the teaching, he is going to tell you what to do. And so this is a concept that's almost departed from us today. Really and truly. Okay, all right. Anyway, he says, how are these things? Establishing a teacher, acquiring a friend, judging people charitably, and I'm reading from page 30 right now at the bottom. How are they related to each other? He said, because these three pieces of advice deal with close relationships. And the closest relationship outside of one's own family is with one's Rav, with one's rabbi. Anybody know what Rav means anyway? Rav is directly from the Hebrew word for much. So a rabbi actually means my Rav, okay? Which is why your rabbi, you call him a Rabbi, my Rav, all right? The E sound on the end of it is personal possession, okay? So what is a Rav? Rav comes from the Hebrew word for much, a lot. And that's what a Rav is. He's a lot. A real rabbi is a lot. He has a lot of learning. He has a lot of love. He has a lot of wisdom in him. He is Torah, in a sense. He is, because it's not just, especially when we come back to the sages of Israel, the original rabbis, the original Rav, they were Torah in their entire life. So it wasn't just important, and this is why when we go back 2,000 years in that period of time, we see in all of these groups, we see people who were itinerant rabbis, if you will, rabbis who went from place to place and taught here and taught there, or maybe they had a school and they had a lot of disciples, okay? But why did the disciples leave everything they had and follow that rabbi? Because it wasn't just important that they understood what he was saying. Because a Rav is someone who is Torah in every aspect of his life. So a Rav, not only does he speak the Torah at all times, but he eats it, he breathes it, he lives it. So it's not just important to hear his words, you have to see how he eats. You have to see how he conducts himself with other people. You have to see how he does business. You have to see how he sleeps. You have to see how he walks, all of those things, because every aspect of it is Torah. I think there are a few of these kind of rabbis in the world today. I don't think there are many, but there are a few. And so that's really what a rabbi should be, in my opinion, but what do I know? Okay. So he says the closest relationship outside of your family is with your Rav, with your Torah teacher. The next is with a friend, and then comes all other people. Now, so let's jump to page 31 and get these comments, these little things that freaked me out just a little bit. Sure. Let's pick up on page 31. I didn't mean to make such a long introduction, but these are just things that I know that Rabbi Tuvia Basser is not going to cover in the book. We should, he says, accept a Torah teacher upon yourself, acquire a friend for yourself. We should be receptive, the Maharal is saying, to learn from a Torah scholar who has something to offer. And we know, I mean, we have to have our own, we have to know enough Torah that we can know a Torah teacher who has something to offer. Even, the Maharal says, even if he is not learned enough to serve as our main Torah teacher, it is worth the effort. And this is when it says aseh, to make for yourself. It's worth the effort that required to accept that person as a teacher, whether we learn much or little from him. Now he asks a question. In the next where it says, acquire a friend for yourself. And that is exactly what it says. It says, ukaneh lecha chaver. Literally, buy a friend for yourself. Very interesting. Why is the word acquire used in connection with getting a friend, whereas accept or make for yourself is used in connection with getting a Torah teacher? Because he says a friend is acquired or bought in the sense that you will do things for your friend and vice versa. If your friend needs a ride, you will give it to him. If your friend needs help making his house payment, you will help him. And he'll do the same for you. And this is why the Hebrew is so specific here, why it says it this way. In other words, Maharal says, the friendship is actually owned in partnership between two friends. But by contrast, the relationship between a Torah teacher or a Rav and his student is not that way. Is never such that the Rav could be called an acquisition. In other words, that you actually buy him, okay? But in both cases, and this is important that we get this, because sometimes we're just sitting around waiting for things to fall on us from the sky. And he says, in both cases, the use of a very active expression, a verb, such as make, or accept, or acquire, carries a very powerful message. He says, this Mishnah tells us we have to make the effort. We have to initiate things. We have to make the effort to create the friend, to create the teacher relationship, even with a person who maybe not be so well suited to you that the relationship would form naturally, because the Maharal says it's always better to have a friend than to be alone, no matter what. Now, judge everyone favorably. He said this means at its basic level, he says that we have to give a positive overall evaluation to all people, no matter what. And we have to, especially when it comes to your Rav, your rabbi, or your Torah teacher, or your friend, especially there you have to be prepared to overlook things when it's necessary. And he says, never rebuff a person by telling that person that he is unworthy. Because number one, you spoke a lie. This is a soul just like yours that came from Hashem. It may be in a mess, it may not know anything, it may be blinded, it may be chasing off after some other crazy philosophy of life or whatever, but don't ever say that it's unworthy, because that's not a reflection on the person. When you say that, that's actually a direct reflection back on Hashem himself when we think or say such a thing, even though people can make us crazy. Okay? Okay. You notice he didn't say you can't say they make you crazy. No, no. He means seriously, judge everyone in a favorable manner. If at all possible, do it. Now, he's picking it back up because he wants to do another approach on this whole thing that we just talked about. He says another approach explains this Mishnah as referring to one's principal Rav. In other words, you may have many Torah teachers. You may have connections with many rabbis, and you may learn from many different rabbis. But one of those rabbis needs to be your principal. One of them needs to be the authority for you when it comes to matters of Torah. Whether for halakha, for a legal decision, okay, or for just the general area of Torah knowledge, one of them needs to be your principal. And he says, so this approach explains this Mishnah is referring to your principal Rav, and also to your lifelong friend, whoever that might be. And the expression, judge everyone favorably, also actually refers, in this approach, it actually refers back on those two people, on your principal Torah teacher and your friend. You should judge them favorably. I'm glad he put this approach in, because sometimes, see, when we're thinking about this, and he comes and he says, and judge everyone favorably, well, that means all those people on the outside. No, it also means all the people that are on the inside close to you. It means them also. So it means your Torah teacher, it means your friend, it means your children, it means your spouse, it means anyone who has a close relationship with you also. Because you know what we do. We tend to actually judge them, the people who are closer to us, more harshly than we would judge someone on the outside. Much more. And so he's saying that in this interpretation, he says, the use of these strong terms, make for yourself a Rav, acquire for yourself a friend, teaches that it takes effort, he says. It takes effort to cultivate and to maintain close relationships. Judge your teacher and your friend favorably and overlook those offenses. He says, and the offenses are, by the way, are bound to arise. You know why? He says, because when people spend so much time together, you start to see things. You won't, it's an amazing thing because I've done Torah teaching tours to Israel for so long, and people who may be good friends here can sometimes go together to Israel and spend 15, 16 days together, and they can't stand each other when we're on the way back, by the time we're on the way back, because they've been in each other's presence so much, and all the little flaws are just repeated over and over again. And this is exactly what this is talking about. When that happens, you have to overlook those things. You have to train yourself to overlook those things. He says those offenses that are bound to arise when people spend so much time together. By assuming, he says, always the best of your friend or the best of your teacher, you prevent a rift and you are able to preserve the relationship. So in summary, he says this Mishnah number 6 of Yehoshua ben Pirkei, deals with general social conduct, he says, because we live, and of course he's talking and speaking to the Jewish people, but it's an amazing thing to me, and we're working all the time to improve this relationship, of how much non-Jewish people also are coming into this idea. And what he says, we live as part of a kindred people. And of course that's true in the Jewish community, absolutely, but I'm just fascinated, and absolutely it's a wonderful thing that is now widening and spreading to include all those who are considering themselves either B'nai Noach or even Torah observant Christians or whatever they are. In their connection to Israel, that feeling is spreading wider every day, and it's a nice thing. So he says, so even though it's dealing with general social conduct, because he says, because we live as part of a kindred people, whether we are rabbis, whether we are peers, or whether we are others, and especially within the nation of Israel, that's very, very true. We all know where we came from, and we all know somehow we're related, and we all know that somehow we're responsible for each other, okay? My point was that's also coming to play in all of the non-Jewish peoples of the world who are really getting a hold of Torah also. Successfully says participation in society, guess where it comes from? Now remember the way the Maharal is going. He is saying when we come to the pairs, one of them is showing us the love of Hashem, the love of God, and the next one is showing us the opposite side, the fear of Hashem. So this one, he says, Yehoshua ben Pirkei is showing how the love of Hashem is played out in our actions in this level, in the level of general social conduct. And he says, successful participation in society is something that flows from the love of God. Amazing. Something that flows from the love of God as we draw people close, because our love for God includes the love of the people that He created. You see both things here? Love Hashem your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your resources. Love your neighbor like yourself. Same thing. In practice, he says, this means that we should accept our religious superior, in other words, somebody who is a real rabbi, okay? Even if he's not perfect rabbi. We should accept our peers as companions, even if they don't completely measure up to our standards. And finally, we should not judge another person as evil, he says, especially because of a religious shortcoming or any other shortcoming. Don't judge them as unworthy. Don't judge them as evil, okay? Rather, he says, judge everyone favorably and do not let such differences keep you apart. So the basic rule, the Maharal draws a basic rule from this whole thing, and the basic rule is we have to attempt at all costs to draw people near and not to push them away. Okay? All right. Mishnah number 7. Now we come to Nitai Har Arbeli, Nitai of Mount Arbel. Mount Arbel, if you go to Israel, it's right next to the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. It's an unbelievable mountain. It has a very, very distinctive shape, a very, very distinctive history, and it's extremely impressive. And Nitai of Arbel lived lived in this place on the Arbel mountain. And he says, distance yourself from a bad neighbor and do not associate with a wicked person. And then he makes a very, very interesting thing. He says, and do not despair of retribution. We'll talk about it more. Let's look at what the Maharal is saying. So he says, Mishnah 7, in the previous Mishnah, Yehoshua ben Parachiah promoted stronger social ties, okay, based on love for the people. And love for the people, he says, has to be a part of our love for God. You see what he's saying? If we don't love people, and this one really gets me, because what is it Rabbi Richmond said when he was here with us once before? Wasn't he quoting Einstein? What was that he said about loving humanity? He said something about loving humanity, but it's people I can't stand, something like that. the human race or humanity as a whole, but it's just, in other words, individual people that he can't stand. And this was something from Einstein. I can't remember the whole quote. I'll have to look it up. But the idea here is that if I as a Jew don't love another Jew, even if he's not measuring up, even if he's not thinking like I think, even if he doesn't observe the Torah like I observe the Torah, if I don't love him, I also don't love God. Simple as that, honestly. Okay. So love for the people is part of the love of God. In this Mishnah, Nitai of Arbel, what does he do? He brings the complement to that, the musar of his colleague, from the perspective of the fear of heaven. All right? And from the perspective of the fear of heaven, he says, we need to avoid harmful relationships. Now, my mother would boil all of this down into one small saying that Nitai Arbeli said, don't run with the wrong crowd. No, okay? That would be what she would tell us. But let's take every one of his statements because he is a sage. Distance yourself from a bad neighbor. He says, the Maharal brings to us, he quotes from the Talmud here in Negaim 12:6. He says, this is actually a reference to one of the statements of the sages, where they say, woe to an evil person and also woe to his neighbor. Now, if none of you have never had actually an evil neighbor before in your life, you don't understand this. If you have had such a thing, then you do understand what's going on. But for sure, everyone, especially everyone who has children, understand about running with the wrong crowd, the effect it can have upon you. Okay? Do not associate with a wicked person, he says. The point is illustrated by this verse, and the verse he is going to quote is actually, in Hebrew, it's Devei Hayamim Beit. That's 2 Chronicles, okay? 2 Chronicles, chapter 20 and verse 37. So look at the point that's made here. Then Eliezer ben Dodavahu of Maresha prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, because you have joined yourself with the evil Achaziahu, Hashem will destroy what you have done. And the ships were wrecked, and they were not able to go to Tarshish. Now, what this is, if we actually look in 2 Chronicles, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, had went in a league, okay, with the king of the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes in the north, and they built ships. And they were going to sell those ships in a joint effort to Tarshish, all right? And then this prophet comes, a prophet that we don't hear about anywhere else in the entire Tanakh, Eliezer ben Dodavahu, and he tells Jehoshaphat, he says, because you have joined yourself with this evil king. Jehoshaphat was a good king. Yeah, I mean, he was an extremely good king, walked in the ways of his father David. But in this instance, he joined himself with somebody who was totally evil, and because of that, he says, Hashem will destroy what you have done. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. all of their ships. They set sail with them. Big storm came, wrecked every one of them, and did away with the entire venture. The Maharal is trying to tell us that's what Pirkei Avot is trying to say. If you are working deals with somebody who is evil, with somebody who is totally, which means, by the way, let's put that in terms that we can even better understand, which means, by the way, they are totally, not only are they run by their evil inclination, but they have bad intentions. They're not good people. They're totally, completely covered up with the shell of the will to receive for their self alone. Totally. And he says, if you do this, there's disaster waiting for you. Absolutely. In one way or another. Again, the consequences of running with the wrong crowd. That's what this Mishnah is all about. Distance yourself, he says, from a bad neighbor, and do not associate with a wicked person. He says we can avoid association with a wicked person just by keeping away from him. Unless you're put in a situation where you can't. Unless he becomes your neighbor. Okay? Then it says, and so he says we can avoid, he just says do not associate with a wicked person. But when it comes to a neighbor, if that wicked person is your neighbor, it says harchek, it means get away from him. Distance yourself from a bad neighbor. A bad neighbor, the Maharal says, must be actively distanced. You must put distance between you and them, because he will come to you. He is going to come to you even if you don't associate with him. Okay? He's still going to come to you. I understand this Mishnah very, very well. Now he says, now he has two different ways. The Maharal is going to present two completely different ways to understand this very, very interesting phrase he uses at the end, and don't despair of retribution or don't despair of punishment, okay? And we don't even begin to have time in this session to get them, so that's exactly where we'll pick up the next time we're together. Is that okay with you? I hope so, because that's what I'm going to do. Okay. So I would just tell you, thank you for sitting with me and let us work through these, and hopefully the Pirkei Avot, is all this wisdom from the great sages will start to penetrate us, and it can really make a big difference in your life. You'll be surprised at the situations you will be in when suddenly you'll recall something that the sages said in this tractate of the Mishnah, and you'll say, wow, boy, do I ever need that right this minute. This is absolutely true. Okay, so we'll pick up with this don't despair of retribution the very next time. Shalom uvracha, peace and a blessing. So shalom aleichem. Again, we're studying Pirkei Avot. We're in Mishnah number 7 of the very first chapter. As I keep telling you, this is going to take a very long time, but that's okay. There's so much there that we need to know. And we're using, especially as a commentary, a book based on the Maharal of Prague, Pirkei Avot. It's put out by Art Scroll, written by, put together or edited by Rabbi Tuvia Basset. It's a very, very good one. And although we're going to some other interesting commentary also, and then from time to time I just throw my 2 cents, whether you like it or not. And so that's the way it is. Let's pick up where we left off, because we're in Mishnah number 7, which has to do with Pirkei Avot. And he says, distance yourself from a bad neighbor. And you asked me during the break, does that mean if you have a bad neighbor, maybe you should move? If it comes to that, maybe that's your only choice, to put distance between yourself and a bad neighbor. Don't associate with a wicked person, he said, and we looked at everything that had to do, and that has to do with the crowd that you run with, okay? And then the final thing where he says, and don't despair, don't lose hope concerning retribution or concerning punishment. Now the Maharal takes an entirely different take on that. Let's look at what he says first, and then let's look at a more traditional, the way I've always understood it, take. He says some things very, very interesting. He presents 2 different ways to understand that on do not despair of retribution. One explanation, he says, sees do not despair of retribution That is the reason behind the first part of the Mishnah of distancing yourself from a bad neighbor and not associating with a wicked person. You might associate with evil people and think that everything is okay, that all is well. However, the consequences of your association with wicked people could strike so suddenly that it will be too late to save yourself from the consequences, from the effect. Therefore, distance yourself from an evil neighbor and do not associate with a wicked person now, before it's too late, before the retribution comes, before the punishment comes. Okay? That's one way of looking at it. Another explanation, he says, of this statement would translate the word that's used for retribution as referring to actually any kind of harmful situation, not necessarily a punishment. According to that interpretation, this entire Mishnah is actually telling us at the end, it's telling us through the entire Mishnah to be cautious and to avoid dangerous situations. Whether that means avoiding evil people or avoiding any kind of harmful situation, okay? That's the other way to look at it. And then we're going to see a third one. Nitai, he says, Nitai of Arbel warns us to be vigilant against the death and the destruction that are an integral part of this physical world. To beware of it. Indeed, the potential for harm, he says, presents a more imminent threat than any human neighbor because it actually hovers over us constantly. It can be there in a second. I mean, that's like tonight, we'll finish these classes, we'll all get in the car and go home, and we don't, because we're so used to it, we don't understand the risk of what we're doing. Honestly. And the potential for a harmful situation is always there. I wouldn't completely push our understanding concerning this way. I think it's included in it. And what Nitai of Arbel is basically saying here, if in this level of understanding him, is just that we need to be aware that this world, there are harmful things, and don't walk along like an idiot. Okay? Don't walk along like the stupid person that we were talking about earlier, Tony. Be aware, in other words, of what's going on, and be aware that there are dangerous situations. This is a good idea. He goes on, he said also, he is telling us that we should not trust. The only thing we should trust in is Hashem. We shouldn't trust that wealth, that if we have money, that will save us from difficult times. In our own economy, it's unbelievable. Just the past few weeks, there have been a lot of wealthy people, I'm telling you, in the United States, who suddenly, in a matter of an instant, are no longer wealthy. So he says, don't trust that wealth can save you from difficult times. That's what Haman did, okay, in the book of Esther, and his success was reversed in the blink of an eye. This Mishnah, he says, tells us judiciously to not give up on harmful events rather than telling us to worry about harmful events, because worrying about impending danger is itself an undesirable trait. So it's not telling us to worry, it's telling us to be aware, okay, to be aware that there are harmful events. Now, I want to actually go to my Siddur, this particular one, which is the RCA edition, and they have an interesting note here. Their understanding, and this is more the basic understanding that I've always had of this Mishnah, where it says, and do not despair of retribution or of punishment. Their comment here is that the doctrine of divine retribution, what is that? That God eventually punishes the wicked. He purifies the wicked. Okay? That is one of the foundations, he says, of the faith. People don't get away with murder. Even though it seems slow in coming, and that's from our perspective, even though it seems slow in coming, we must remain confident that there will be a time of judgment. Otherwise, a good person may come to feel that evil and dishonesty will always be ascendant, that they may come to the feel that that's the way you have to go to make it. This passage, he says, also can be interpreted Not to despair because of punishment, because God punishes you for this or punishes you for that, chastises you. Don't despair because of that, because even though you have been punished, always remain hopeful. Don't get into a despair, because despair, by the way, and depression, as Rebbe Nachman comes and teaches us, they are the worst enemies of your soul. So he says, always remain hopeful. There is always repentance. There is always forgiveness. Always. Okay? So those are another two ways. So we've seen 4 different levels. That's interesting because we have 4 levels of interpretation when it comes to the written text of the Torah. And we see 4 different ways of understanding this beautiful Mishnah of Nitai of Arbel. When as before, when we just read through it, we always say, oh, that's good advice. Don't get mixed up with the wrong crowd. That's right, but there's so much more to it than that. There's layer after layer that is hidden in all of the statements of the sages. It's an amazing thing. Okay. Do you think we might be able to do Mishnah 8? We'll try it, okay? I'm not making any promises, but we'll try it. Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shatak, they received the tradition from them. From who? The previous 2. Yehoshua ben Parachia and Nitai of Arbel. So they received the tradition from them. And Yehuda ben Tabai says, and they add these words in because actually we have to understand who he's talking to, okay? When you serve as a judge, so he's actually really and truly, he's speaking, we have to remember this is much over 2,000 years ago, okay? He's speaking to rabbis, all right? And when they serve as a judge, he says, do not act as a lawyer. But that also, by the way, even though he's speaking to rabbis, let's move it to us also. Because we stand in judgment many, many times where we have to judge between 2 people, which one is telling us the truth, which one is not telling us the truth, on and on and on. And we end up being the judge of those things. So this also is directly to us, whether we like it or whether we don't like it. So when we serve as a judge, if you're the judge, you shouldn't act as a lawyer. Okay? That's what he's saying. And when the litigants stand before you, you should consider them both guilty. Now we would say, no, that's not right. We have to consider them both innocent. Not according to the Torah wisdom of Yehuda ben Tabai. He says, consider them both guilty. But when they are dismissed from you, consider them both as innocent, provided if they have accepted the judgment. Let's look at what the Maharal says. The Hebrew term, he says, that is translated as lawyer, refers to anyone, what it refers to is anyone who tutors a litigant with regard to how to formulate their arguments. So if the judge can't say, you should say it this way, okay? Or who presents the litigant's case to the judges. And the Mishnah is directed to judges, warning them not to coach the litigants in any way. Such conduct is strictly forbidden. And the reason it's forbidden is because it can modify, it can change the outcome of the judgment. This admonition, he says, is critical to the fair administration of justice because it is likely, and indeed not uncommon, for a judge to be more sympathetic to one litigant than the other, just from the way they look, just from the way they dress, just from the way they speak, or manners or whatever. And this is a real thing, especially in a courtroom, on a judge being absolutely, totally impartial in every manner. It is a grave error, he says, to assume that one litigant is more likely to be innocent or that one is more likely to be a dishonest person. Rather, the judge must consider them equally likely to be guilty or innocent, but both of them. It is preferable for the judge actually to consider them to both be dishonest. It's very interesting. To both be dishonest, because then He will scrutinize every claim, each one's claim, and he will probe the case in depth. If he assumes that they're actually dishonest and they're not really telling him the truth, then he's going to ask questions. He's going to get down to the real bottom line truth of the matter. It's very interesting. This is a different way of thinking, okay? But I'm sure it's good advice. Even for us, when we have to make decisions on things like that. Consider them, where he says, consider them both as innocent, provided they have accepted the judgment. Rabbi Basser says the Maharal seems to have, he says the Maharal himself, in his commentary, actually seems to have had an alternative text. In other words, his text of Pirkei Avot was different in one word than what we have in the text that we have before us. That's very interesting. Because his reads, consider them both not as innocent, but consider them both as righteous. All right? Every respectable citizen comes to court in the belief, we're talking about civil cases, not criminal cases. Every respectable citizen comes to court in the belief that his case is just. Therefore, it takes a truly righteous person to accept that an unfavorable judgment, has been just. How can a judge, he says, reasonably consider both parties guilty and then consider them both innocent or both righteous? While the case is in progress, both parties are equally likely to be guilty, because there is no reason to consider one litigant different from the other, and they are both engaged in the dispute. All right? When the case has been settled, though, without antagonism, and the litigants have accepted the judgment, then the judge can see that the monetary dispute in this civil matter was an honest and dispassionate misunderstanding, and that the litigants have actually been righteous from the very beginning. This is what he's saying, he's talking about. But basically, Yehuda ben Tabai is trying to tell us something, and I'm sure it has to do with coming from the love of Hashem, of how a judge has to act and how he has to serve when he is judging between the case of two people. All right? Now, Mishnah number 9. I can't believe it. We're going to move to Mishnah number 9. Shimon ben Shatak says, interrogate the witnesses extensively and be cautious with your words, lest through your words, the litigants, the witnesses, learn to lie. Learn to tell you what you want to hear. Shimon ben Shatak, he says, continues to address the point of the previous Mishnah as he advocates the pursuit of righteous judgment. It is important, he says, to be thorough when examining a witness, because he might embellish a detail or he might withhold a detail upon which everything in the whole case will depend. If the judge doesn't choose his words carefully, then a witness can discern the direction of the examination from the questions, and then he can alter his testimony to suit his purpose. I mean, this is every law school should work on this, what he's saying here, because these are shenanigans that go on. He said we said before that the first rabbi of each pair advises us, gives us musar from the perspective of the love of Hashem and enjoins some positive action. The first musar is always, the first Mishnah in the pairs are always positive, and the second one will be don't do something, okay? Usually.
And musar as
A
well.
musar is, we can say advice or we can say ethical advice, but it's even more than that. I mean, it's critical advice, okay? Constructive criticism, there we go. But it's actually even more than just this, because it's constructive criticism with the expectation that you will learn from the constructive criticism. Instead of being ticked off at the rabbi who said it, you will learn from it and put it to work in your life. That's the idea, okay? Anyway, enjoying some positive action, he says the second of the pair brings the perspective of the fear of heaven and always cautions against violating a commandment. This pair of rabbis, he says, also follows that pattern because judgment has aspects of both love and fear. Yehuda ben Tabai focused on the love of God in his statement. When the litigants stand before you, consider them both as guilty. But when they are dismissed from you, consider them both as innocent or righteous. This supports the mitzvah, the commandment, okay? Where does this come from? Did they just dream this up? No. See, and this is something I hear from time to time, you know. Oh, that oral Torah stuff, that stuff the rabbis added, they just dreamed that stuff up. Never. Absolutely never. So, where does this idea even come from? There is a commandment, there is a mitzvah in Vayikra 19:15. It's, by the way, the source for both of these Mishnayot. Vayikra, Leviticus 19:15 says, in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. So Yehuda ben Tabai is sitting down and saying, okay, from the perspective of the love of God, what does it mean in righteousness, if I'm a judge, in righteousness, do I judge my neighbors, my part of the nation? Shimon ben Shatak focused on the fear of God in his statement, interrogate the witnesses extensively, be careful with your words, lest through them they learn to lie. And this advice avoids the transgression, and it's from the same transgressing this mitzvah. It's in the same verse of Leviticus, Vayikra 19:15. Okay, where the first part was in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor, and Shimon ben Shatak takes his from the rest of that verse, you shall not commit a perversion of justice in judgment. So here, these two Mishnayot, these two parts of the oral Torah, are connected specifically to one verse in the Torah. Now, admittedly, some things in the oral Torah, especially when we come to Midrashim, and oftentimes when we come to the Sod level in Kabbalah, and many times also even in the Remez level, they will be jumping off of a single word, or maybe even a single letter, or the way a single letter is written in some specific way. But there is always some connection between what's in the oral Torah and what's in the written Torah. Always. Okay. Now, I don't know if I should start Mishnah 10 or not, because it's a little more extensive, because it's, well, you know, we can start it. We have 10 minutes. I won't finish it, I'm sure. But we'll start it. Mishnah number 10. The Maharal tells us at the beginning, he says, the musar of this pair of rabbis is directed toward the spiritual leaders of the community, so that their conduct will fortify the love and fear of God within the community. Now this is interesting. Listen to so directed toward the spiritual leaders of the community means the rabbis. Shemaiah ve'Avtalyon. Shemaiah and Avtalyon received the Torah from them, the previous two. And Shemaiah says, Ehav et hamelacha, love work. Melacha is even creative work, okay? Love it. Usna et harabanut, and hate it says, and despise holding office. But the word rabbanut are the head rabbis who are paid by the community to be the head rabbis. Like, this is talking about something that's strictly within Israel, I mean, within the religious community. And do not become overly familiar with the government. So the Maharal tells us, now we have to remember also the Maharal lived 500 years ago. Shemaiah and Avtalyon lived much over 2,000 years ago. All right? And we also have to remember that any reference that they're making here to government and government officials and all of those things, they're not made in reference to democratically elected or supposedly democratically elected leaders of republic countries, democratic republics today, all right? All of their governments were monarchies, dictatorships, much, much different in some ways than what we have today, but in other ways the same, all right? Because we're going to be able to see things that from our own experiences with government, we'll still see things even though we are familiar with a democratic republic, okay, form of government. Okay. Shemaiah and Avtalyon, the first thing he tells us is that this is quite interesting. He says they were descended from converts to Judaism.
Say that again?
They were descended, their ancestors were converts to Judaism, were non-Jews, their fathers were non-Jews who converted to Judaism. Okay? Those who say that they themselves, in other words, that both of them were converts to Judaism are mistaken, the Maharal says, because if they had been a first-generation convert to Judaism, is not qualified for appointment to the offices of the president, the Nasi, or the head of the Beit Din of the Sanhedrin, okay? They can't be on the Sanhedrin. So obviously, they weren't first-generation converts. He says they are descended from converts, though, of non-Jewish men who were married to, he said their mothers were of Israelite descent, who were married to Jewish women, okay? Very, very interesting what he's saying. Why he mentions it, I think it's interesting that he mentions it. Especially, for what reason? He wrote 500 years ago. I mean, and this story about them being converts is actually found in the Talmud in two different places. In Tractate Gittin and in Tractate Yoma about them. I think it especially important because especially since the classes I teach and even on UTN, in comparison with Jewish people who learn from the classes and non-Jewish people who learn from the classes, there are many more non-Jews who learn from the classes than there are Jews. And here in Pirkei Avot are two people who their ancestors effectively came from the non-Jewish world. They converted to Judaism, and Shemaiah and Avtalyon are one of the pairs who brought down all of the oral tradition, all of the oral Torah, all of the oral teaching from the previous generation and passed it to the next. That's amazing to me. The great Rabbi Akiva, when we come to him, we find out that his family, also long before in the past, also were converts to Judaism. Very, very amazing thing. Anyway, I just mentioned it in passing, but just that mention took up 5 minutes. We only have 5 minutes now to look at this. He says, love work and despise holding office. Shemaiah deals first with the love of God. As the rabbis say, and he's quoting here an extensive passage from the Talmud Tractate Yoma 86a, heaven should be beloved through you. These are the sages. A man should study the written and the oral Torah, and apprentice to scholars. In other words, be a disciple of scholars. He should speak gently with people. His purchasing and business dealings should be pleasant. He should conduct his business in good faith. What do people say of such a person? Fortunate is this one who learned Torah. How beautiful are his ways, how proper is his conduct. This is in reference to each and every one of us, but it's especially in reference to a spiritual leader or a rabbi. But what I point out to you here is, look how people know that we have learned Torah. It's in speaking gently with people. It's in purchasing and business dealings being pleasant and honest, conducting business in good faith. Interesting. Likewise, the Maharal says, likewise, a Torah scholar brings honor to Torah and honor to God, and he inspires the love of God when he is not dependent upon the people. The rabbis tell us, and this also is from the sages in the Talmud, that people were highly resentful of Moshe Rabbeinu. You remember when Moshe has to pray, I didn't take not even one donkey from one of them. Why? Because what they were doing was they were going around saying, you know, we pay his salary. How can he speak to us in such a way? How can he tell us what we can and can't do? We pay his salary. But the deal was they didn't. They didn't pay his salary, and that's why Moshe Rabbeinu says what he says. But they were resentful of Moshe Rabbeinu, claiming that he was living comfortably through the use of public funds, temple funds. But in truth, Moshe Rabbeinu was independently wealthy. He was rich all on his own. He didn't need their help. But the point is, if people could unjustly resent Moshe Rabbeinu, who was independently wealthy, how do you think they view, he says, rabbinical leaders who actually are supported by public funds? Because see, the Rabbanut in Israel, that is exactly the way they are supported. If you are on the Council of Rabbis, you are a public rabbi, so you're supported through tax money. And this is what he's saying, this is what Shemaiah says is not such a good thing. He doesn't think it's wise. Communal support, he says, undermines the honor of the Torah. And if Torah scholars didn't accept that support, then the esteem for Torah among the community at large would rise to great heights. Furthermore, rabbis would then not show favoritism. Because see, the rabbis are being called upon to be judges in disputes. They would not show favoritism, and they would be able to reprove the public, to tell them what they need to hear, okay? Whose transgressions are their responsibility. Now, however, because they are dependent upon the community, every rabbi has acquired for himself a master. It's a point. The Maharal, it says, lived over 400 years ago, very closer to 500. Maharal himself maintained, it says, his independence. This is Rabbi Tuvia Basser coming and telling us. Maintained his independence. In other words, they didn't pay him a salary. He had other business dealings that he did, and he didn't need communal support. Okay? And that made him in a place where he could say what he needed to say. So it says he constantly had to reprove the community, and this is in Prague, okay, on matters of Lashon Hara and of drinking non-kosher wine. These were two things that he was constantly having to work on. Okay. Anyway, so positions of authority, he ends saying, oh, we'll pick up right there. Actually, we don't want to go any farther. Now, there's a lot of pros and cons to this whole thing of what's going on, but basically, Shemaiah is correct. He's saying that if the rabbi is working for the government, if he is holding an office, if the spiritual leader is holding an office, then he is beholden upon the government, he is beholden upon the support. We're talking about a government rabbi. That's what the Rabbanut in Israel today is. That is all being supported to them. and they don't have any outside way of making money. So that puts them in an unfavorable position to be able to be a real rabbi sometimes. That's all he's saying. Especially in his days, I'm sure it wasn't good. What even worse, not only would you lose your paycheck, you would probably also lose your head in the days of Shemaiah. Okay, if you really said what needed to be said. Okay, we'll finish with that. We'll pick up again with the next part because we have a lot more to look at here. I appreciate you very much. Shalom uvracha to you. Peace and a blessing. Shalom, shalom.